Hashanah once again. I have his formal bio in front of me. I mentioned to him that I thought he's been here enough times that we don't need to announce his formal bio. Even though it's quite impressive, if you'd like to look at it, go online and you could see for yourself how impressive a person he is. But I do want to say just one word by way of introduction, and that is, we traveled to Israel a number of years ago and had the great fortune to have Dr. Rehfeld and his family on that trip as well. And I learned an awful lot about him during that trip, not because we spoke so much, but rather, as the Hasidic masters teach, I watched him tie his shoelaces. That means I watched the way in which he conducted and comported himself. And if you think you're listening to a man who is some kind of politician, or some kind of academic, or some kind of bureaucrat, then you don't know the heart of the person who will address the congregation today. I watched him play beautiful music. I watched him move the spirits and souls of the individuals on that trip. And I watched him play music late into the night for Havdalah at the end of Shabbat with our dear friend Arthur Greenberg of blessed memory, who sat right there in shul. And I remember that moment more than almost anything else, more than all the articles that he's written, the books that he's written, more than the speeches that he's given. That's what sticks out, because we're looking at a person of deep personage. So I hope that you'll get a sense of that deep personage today on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, as we invite our friend Dr. Andrew Rehfeld to address our congregation as we bless each other with Hashanah Tovah.
Rabbi Rose, thank you so much for that introduction. And I just want to say what a moving tribute that was to 9/11, and I'm still deeply moved by it. We all have our own 9/11 memories, but thank you for that. And Rabbi Rose, thank you again for that. It's important to know that the talk that I'm going to give today is entitled My View from 30 of the last 30 years, given, of course, as it is in this year of 2048. The idea was to look back in the hopes of looking forward. And so I thank you. It's been a very long time and really quite a joy to be invited back here to the congregation for yet another holiday talk. When Carney first invited me to speak in 2012, I had just begun my tenure as the CEO of the Jewish Federation of St. Louis, and that was 36 years ago. It feels like more like 6, doesn't it? I've always appreciated the invitation to speak at this now historic facility. It is looking a bit weathered, though, by now, isn't it? I was delighted to hear that you are launching your first renovation campaign in 3 decades. The last one you did brought this institution fully into the 21st century and provided such a dynamic home for the shul, creating spaces that enabled the spiritual growth, educational engagement, and the community development that this and all congregations are here to provide. And they must be designed for the needs that you are facing now and in the future, rather than designed for the ones that you had before. A good example of this is the designs I have now seen for your newly proposed Obermann-Alper holographic educational wing. Now, what a great way to lead our community into the second half of the 21st century. Since we're talking about changes, let me start with an announcement of my own. I want to formally announce that I have decided to finally retire as the CEO of the Federation the start of next calendar year. That's right, January 1st, 2049 will be my last day in this role. It's true I'm now only in my early 80s, but God willing, I still may have some other projects I want to pursue. And with life expectancy now closing in on Moshe Rabbeinu's own 120, I am beginning to think about my next career move after we complete our next annual campaign. Since I'm marking changes, congratulations to you, Rabbi Rose, for announcing your own retirement in 2050 at the completion of the capital campaign. Carney has had a spectacular run of over 4 decades, inspiring so many of us to deepen our engagement in Jewish life in meaningful ways. Your leadership will truly be missed. Fortunate for all of us is that Cantor Sharon Nathanson has accepted the role as your new spiritual leader. And where is Cantor Nathanson or Hazan Nathanson? I did it again. I mess up her title every time. Old habits die hard. Now that she's received her rabbinic ordination of a decade ago, it's of course Cantor Rabbi Nathanson. I look forward to celebrate. It took a minute, right? Look forward to celebrating these milestones with you later in 2050 when your newly renovated Shuval Baron Lapp Rosenblatt Sanctuary reopens. And I also want to recognize the announced retirement of Missouri's second Jewish Governor Zimmerman, who is now completing his 5th full term in office. Jake, you've done your community and your parents so very proud. People change, technology changes, buildings change. Even the way we understand Jewish life changes. All of these things have always changed. And once, as our Rabbi Rose once taught this congregation, just about 30 years ago, change sure can be hard. But if the last 30 years have taught us anything, it's that change is necessary. It was then, and it is now. Today I want to talk not so much about change, but about what not to do in the face of change. And standing today here in 2048, it is the story of how our people managed to come so precariously close to losing the Jewish state of Israel. The near loss of Israel as a Jewish state came not from military force or the slow destruction of terrorism, as it might have been in the first decades of Israel's existence, but from another source entirely. It was during the teens and 20s of this century, from roughly 2014 through 2028, that our people continued to fight the enemies of Israel as if they were fighting those same earlier existential battles. Of course, today we all look back in surprise because even by 2001, and certainly by 2014, Israel faced no military threats of the sort that confronted it in 1948, 1956, 67, or 73. Israel was a nuclear power by then, with the 8th largest army in the world. And 30 years ago, in the late teens of this century, Israel faced no serious military threat from invading armies, had peace agreements with Jordan and Egypt, a collapsing Syria, which provided its own kind of problems, but not an invasion. It had active strategic partnerships with Saudi Arabia that would later fulfill themselves in a major new peace plan. It had growing economic interests in China and India, and a booming economy. No, the near loss of Israel came not from the external military threat or economic collapse, but how we confronted generation change by looking backwards rather than forwards. And while the new 5-year-old peace agreement that ended finally the Israeli-Palestinian conflict seemingly once and for all has kept a Jewish state for now, our ability to keep that state lies only in our ability to face our new challenges with the wisdom of our tradition and a gaze kept fully looking forward. It is hard to believe that we commemorated the 100th anniversary of the modern state of Israel this past spring. It felt like our entire community gathered to recognize this moment. Most of us still celebrate Israel as a vibrant democracy with the largest concentration of Jewish people on the planet, defying all odds to achieve incredible technological, humanitarian, agricultural, academic innovation that has made us proud and should make us proud. But for the last 5 years, a growing number in our community treats Israeli Independence Day as a day of mourning, because as fate would have it, that was also the day that just 5 years ago, Israel's name officially changed to Israel-Palestine, and the entire territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean became a single shared state, with a 60% Arab population and a minority Jewish presence. Now, the Mar-a-Lago Agreement that was signed in 2043 by President Nikki Haley created a single majority state, and yet it maintained Jewish control without giving up democratic principles. as you all know since you lived through this, involved giving diaspora Jews fractional voting power in Israel, although with the immediate escaped options for either the Jews or Palestinians to create their own separate nations through a ballot initiative. I'll review the specifics in a few minutes for a few of you who have forgotten them. But before I do, I want to remind us how we got to Mar-a-Lago and how we got to the creation of a one Palestinian majority state of Israel, a one state of Israel, Palestine in the first place. It was back in 2018, some of you I think may remember, David Makovsky was here in town, and he reminded us in St. Louis that there'd always been two wings of Zionism, and he spread his hands out like this at the United Hebrew Congregation where he spoke. And he talked about one wing being a commitment to a state in which Jewish sovereignty could be realized, and another to a commitment to making sure that the state was a democracy. Now, Makovsky used the term democracy loosely. He was referring to a broader set of human rights that Israel, despite its many critics, had always been committed to since its first days. These commitments are captured in its Declaration of Independence and afforded all people in Israel political rights and access to justice, no matter their race or religion. Nations, like individuals, are never perfectly just, but set aspirational ideals to guide their actions. And Israel, among the most moral, righteous nations of the world, also experienced high and low points in its realization and achievement of its aims of justice for all. Recall that our own path as America has not always been a straight one towards justice. We should never forget our own shameful failure to respond in the late teens of this century, when we as Americans watched a nation founded on being a refuge for the oppressed become an oppressor of the refugee. As Americans, we now look back at the Biden-Collins plan of 2023, named after the fusion presidential administration of President Joe Biden, formerly a Democrat, and Vice President Susan Collins, formerly a Republican, that created a bipartisan plan for immigration reform that returned America to its path of justice to the stranger. It is quaint to remember a time when there were Republicans and Democrats at all, isn't it? I digress. So yes, Israel, like America, is a nation that needs justice as part of its DNA, even if it did not always achieve that ideal. And it achieved a heck of a lot more than it was given credit for at the world stage, even in the time. As Makovsky said, Israel was not simply founded to advance Jewish interests, it was founded to advance the interests of justice, based on our own prophetic tradition. Now, the problem that Mar-a-Lago dealt with finally had been with Israel fully since 1967, when it captured the West Bank, Gaza, and the Golan in the Six-Day War, and more importantly, in the massive expansion of the settlements beyond the security barrier during the first 2 decades of this 21st century. That problem was that Israel could not hold on to the West Bank and Gaza if it wanted to retain both of Makovsky's wings, a Jewish state and a democracy. President Haley's solution at Mar-a-Lago was brilliant, though of course not without controversy. And while it gave up the guarantee of a state governed by Jews, she managed to keep Israel a plausibly democratic and Jewish state by including fractional American votes. It's important to remember how that happened. The seeds of that one-state solution were planted between June of 17 and the summer of 2018 through the 1-2 punch of the Kotel controversy and the nation-state law. Some of you will recall that in 2017, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu went back on an agreement he had made earlier to create a pluralistic prayer space at the Kotel, the Western Wall. I don't know if you recall, but that was also the moment when the board of the Jewish Agency for Israel, the Sochnut, the used-to-be government before 1948 of Israel, when that board decided to protest the policy by publicly boycotting the prime minister, boycotting its dinner with him at the Knesset that evening after he announced his withdrawal from the agreement. That protest, a boycott to protest a decision of the Israeli government undertaken by the leadership of the Jewish Agency in 2017, turned out to be a watershed moment. First, of course, by boycotting a state dinner, the Jewish Agency demonstrated that individuals and groups could actually engage in nonviolent civil protests and boycotts of Israel's policies and leadership without being anti-Semitic. Second, and far more importantly, it raised awareness that Jews of Israel and the Jews of North America were quickly diverging in their attitudes. in their attitudes, their perspectives, and worldviews, particularly to the extent that it appeared to North American Jews that Israel was heading towards religious extremism. Israel had long claimed it was the nation of the Jewish people. It was our nation. Yet the Kotel controversy drew concern that Israel was creating a nation of only one kind of Jew. It's a shame that even today the controversy over the Kotel is framed as a controversy between the Orthodox and liberal Jews. Nothing could have been further from the truth. The controversy was, in fact, a political controversy about who would be given power to enforce religious doctrine in Israel. It exposed the question, why should a modern democracy of Israel have government controlling religion in any way anyway? It was certainly not a principle of Zionist ideology that religious decisions should be backed by force of law. Rather, it was only from expediency at the founding of the state a century ago in 1948 that the hastily constructed government kept the framework inherited not even from the British, but from the Ottomans before them. That they kept those Ottoman provisions in place, provisions that allowed the state to support and enforce one specific kind of Judaism, rather than create a dynamic, democratic system in which the state was an impartial arbiter and created a level playing field in which individuals were free to choose the faith in the manner that they chose it that resonated with them. So the first lesson from the Kotel controversy was that the boycotts of Israel might have some legitimate purpose, and second, that American Jews became aware of the threat of religious extremism developing in Israel. Finally, the third lesson that emerged in this period came from the nation-state law that was passed in the summer of 2018. That law helped American Jews see Israel heading towards Jewish nationalism that threatened the pursuit of democracy and justice for all. You might remember that the law itself actually did very, very little than state what had been true for Israel's history. Hatikva was the national anthem, the flag was still going to be the flag. Even the most controversial part, the reclassification of Arabic into a non-official language, it had been the second official language since 1948, it included a clause that no change in its legal status was going to be made, so that there would not be legal effect. That was confusing, but there it is. It was a law that had a powerful symbolic effect, but not much in terms of legal substance. Yet the debate leading up to the bill, and the reason it caused so much concern, was it laid bare the degree to which extreme Jewish nationalism, bordering on anti-Arab racism, had become more acceptable, if not mainstream, in Israeli society by then. How different that view was from the principles that virtually all Zionists had promoted in founding the state. That a Jewish state was to be built upon three key ideals: that it be a defense of the Jewish people from historic persecution, that it support the flourishing of Jewish culture, including but not limited to religion, and to be a light until the nations, guaranteeing civil and political rights for all. Even Jewish nationalists like Jabotinsky and Begin, who would later become the prime minister, never articulated the kind of extreme Jewish nationalism that we now understand in retrospect became the defining feature of that era. Jewish nationalism in Israel at the time was, of course, part of the broader global return to narrow nationalism in the world throughout the world. Recall that in June of 2016, the former United Kingdom voted to withdraw from the European Union. Even that brief moment, you caught that, I appreciate that. Thank you. Even that brief moment of America First nationalism of the Trump era might have continued, but for Trump's unexpected death by a massive coronary in the summer of 2019, and Pence-Haley's loss to the Biden-Collins fusion ticket in 2020 elections. In fact, the general tendency towards native nationalism peaked in 2021, when at that point the republics of Scotland and Northern Ireland formally left the United Kingdom to rejoin Europe, leaving England and Wales on their own in a hardly united kingdom. As a side note, who doesn't miss London, the once financial capital of Europe? And it shouldn't come as any surprising that Edinburgh would emerge as the new financial hub thanks to global heating. Remember when it used to be called global warming? That was good old days. In preparation for talk, I went back through the newspapers of 30 years ago. There was then a prescient article written by Robert Kagan in the Wall Street Journal on September 8th, 2018. Kagan saw what was happening then and spoke about the precariousness of liberalism in the world. and the need for what was essentially a world power of the United States to help secure global cooperation and shift spending on security towards investment in economic and social growth, particularly in Europe. What was most striking about Kagan's article was that back in 2018, we seem to have forgotten that the world was not inextricably marching towards greater freedom, was not inextricably marching towards democracy. Here's what Kagan wrote 30 years ago, quote, "Perhaps our biggest failure is our unwillingness to imagine that things could look again as they did at the start of the 20th century, with a few besieged democracies hanging on in a world dominated by dictatorships. Aggression was the norm then, not the exception, and every weapon invented by scientists was eventually put to use," end of quote. 70 years after World War II of economic growth and expansion of freedom and democracy were the exception, not the rule. And yes, Israel, despite its many critics, was an embodiment of those liberal democratic ideals of justice because of its commitment to democracy early on. But by 2021, Israel's own commitments to liberal democracy were being seriously questioned. Kagan was right, and of course, thanks to articles like his and leadership that turned back extreme forms of nationalism, the world avoided a descent into another long period of darkness that it seemed at the time it was ready to enter. Now let's speed things up a bit. I want to get to the Mar-a-Lago Agreement and what it means for us Jews today. The first step to get there was the recognition by diaspora Jews in the aftermath of the Kotel and nation-state controversies that they needed a voice in Israel if Israel were to remain truly a nation of the Jewish people. This led first to the creation of a Jewish People's Council in 2022, based loosely on a proposal made a few years earlier by Professor Gil Troy of McGill and Natan Sharansky, Anatoly Sharansky, and the former chair, Likud member and chair of the Jewish Agency. That Jewish People's Council created a representational body that gave all Jews a voice in Israel and dramatically improved engagement from our own communities in the diaspora. It ultimately led to the creation of voting rights for all of us, for non-citizen Jews outside of the state. But because we are not full citizens of Israel, each of our votes is only counted as 1/4 of a full vote, reflecting the fact that we are not subject to the laws of the nation, nor do we serve in its army, nor do we pay its taxes. Now, giving fractional votes to diaspora Jews was the first step towards the Mar-a-Lago peace agreement. The second step was a push for creating a binational state of Jews and Palestinians rather than separate Jewish and Palestinian states. And ironically, of course, the push for a single binational state came unexpectedly from Jewish nationalists and religious extremists. Because remember, Jewish nationalists were the main opponents to giving us, diaspora Jews, any kind of voting power. They used really good arguments to oppose the plan that gave us 1/4 of a vote in Israel's elections. Religious extremists and nationalists argued that votes should only be given to those who are most affected by the policies of a single government, and only those most affected were justified in getting a vote. Only those whose lives are ultimately controlled by the laws that are created by the governments and enforced by those governments by threat of police or army enforcement should have a say. American Jews, they argued, should not be given any rights to affect a government they are not living under. Now, the nationalists and extremists were, of course, trying to stop more moderate North Americans from influencing Israeli elections, from influencing the trajectory of Israel towards more nationalist policies. But in making the argument that only those most affected by the rule of government and the policies that are affected by them through the police should have the right to vote, they inadvertently undermined the continued denying of voting rights to the 2.5 million Palestinians that were living in the West Bank. After all, if the argument that voting rights should not be given to North American Jews because they are unaffected by the decisions of the government, then it followed that those living under the military rule of the Israeli government in the West Bank needed to be afforded those rights on the same basis. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not taking a position for or against this. I'm simply recalling for us all what the history has been. Finally, by the late 2030s, as American Jews were feeling marginalized, religious extremists in Israel were backed into a corner by their own arguments. One other dramatic change occurred, and that is, of course, that Palestinians were finally able to make real concessions and put an end to their interminable opposition to any compromise. The turn began with the now famous nitroglycerin event that resulted in the literal collapse of Hamas in Gaza. You recall one of its own leaders inadvertently blew up an explosives depot. And of course, like most of their most critical military installations, the depot was located in the basement of a central hospital and school complex, tragically killing 3,000 civilians. Now, as fate would have it, the most important Hamas leadership had been meeting in the school auditorium right above the depot at the time. With the death of Mahmoud Abbas at the age of 96 back in 2031, a new generation of Palestinians could emerge, fed up with years of its own corrupt leadership, driven only by hate and anti-Semitism against the Jews as its platform, with an interest in securing economic benefits and opportunities for their kids and a real security and the recognition that they needed a bold plan. The new Palestinian leadership unilaterally disarmed, catching the world by surprise, and even forcing the hardliners in Israel back to the table. External pressure to keep the pact between Israel and Saudi Arabia after Iran developed its nuclear arsenal helped put pressure on the new Palestinian leadership to change. So, putting this all together, the Mar-a-Lago Accords led to the creation of a new single state of Israel-Palestine with these three features. A single government elected by all residents of Israel-Palestine, that is the area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, plus the fractional votes of all Jews in the diaspora. This ensured that a stable majority of votes could maintain the state's Jewish character so long as the Jewish population of itself did not decline much below 40%, where it is right now. To provide the realization of either Jewish Israeli or Palestinian statehood, this is number two, an automatic separation agreement would allow the Palestinians or the Israelis to go their separate ways through popular referendum if 75% of Jews or 75% of Palestinians wanted to take that path. This was just like Brexit had done for that region. The resulting two separate nations of Israel and Palestine would then be democratic and afford equal democratic rights to all citizens within their nation. And importantly, voting for the separation clause would be limited to residents of Israel or Palestine. No fractional votes would apply to that decision. And finally, to ensure there would be no long negotiations, a pre-agreement established the borders of the new Israel and Palestine, should they choose to go their separate ways, along the lines of where the old security barrier used to be in the early part of this century, with a shared capital of Jerusalem. Now, the Mar-a-Lago Accords would thus left 1 million settlers who now live beyond the old security boundary line, ironically opposing separation and the creation of a single Jewish state, because they would then become the minority of citizens within the new state of Palestine. So while the Mar-a-Lago agreements brought some hope for peace and stability, justice and human rights to the region, Israel remains a source of angst and concern of, along with hope and inspiration for our community. As I said, and we all recognize, some in our community view Israel's Independence Day as a day of celebration. Gratefully, most of us still do, while others have added it to our days of mourning, sensing the imminent loss of Jews in the minority, even with the addition of fractional votes from the diaspora. Now, rather than weigh in where this is likely to go, I think we can turn now finally to speak about our own community and think of things that we might have done differently and where we are heading now. So first, I think I'd go back and want to shake my earlier self. Don't you wish you sometimes could go back to 2018 and wonder, why'd you do the things you did then? And shake my earlier self and ask to have taken a stronger stand for democratic engagement by a generation of Jews back then. By 2018, 30 years ago, we may have been winning the battles, but we were losing the war, and it was a different war than we thought we were fighting. I think in particular the failure to recognize how our hard-line stance against the capital BDS movement was actually alienating a new generation from engagement. That explains why today in 2048 so many millennials are uninterested in Jewish life. Their parents and grandparents thought they were protecting their children and grandchildren, as well as Israel, from anti-Semites and anti-Semitism, when all that they were doing was trying to shield them from honest and open conversations about the very injustices that they were seeing that were happening to the Palestinians. Remember, it turned out to be religious extremists who articulated the strongest argument that votes should be given to those most affected by the laws and governments and policies of a government. We should have had the courage to address those challenges without fear. This was particularly true on college campuses, where we were so freaked out by college and other kinds of protests that we reacted to every blip of anti-Israel sentiment with accusations of anti-Semitism. Now, there certainly were vicious anti-Semites in the movement and vicious anti-Semitism, and I'm proud not only of this congregation, but the Federation and the community's support that combated that and provided our college students with real support when they needed it. But we overreacted. What we thought was a battle against anti-Semitism and an anti-Semitic boycott movement to save our kids turned out to be a self-destructive effort that drove the generation from facing the problems Israel was confronting in a manner that would have aligned them with the broad goals of our community and our people. And we did it without recognizing or fighting for the Jewish principles that we should have been fighting for, principles of justice, of decency, of democracy, and of compassion. And you know what? Israel was strong enough then to face honest engagement by our kids and grandkids. Those of you may remember in the summer of 2017, when our first Jewish governor had invited the ambassador of the State of Israel to our own community, Ron Dermer stood on stage in front of hundreds of people, maybe some of you were there, and said out loud, BDS is not a threat to the Israeli economy or to Israel. And yet along we went. I think if I look back to 30 years ago, I would do things differently. I fear it was us who were weak. We were not strong enough to allow our kids to put on Jewish values of justice first, without condition, to openly engage with the Jewish community. And sadly, we lost so many of them. We lost them to Israel. And because of that, we lost them to Jewish life. And we lost them to the Jewish people. That's because in the face of change, we responded with fear. The leadership of the American Jewish establishment responded to the challenges of the teens and the 20s of this century as if we were looking back at the Israel of 67, 48, or 73. And I should know I was there. I bear responsibility for not pushing harder to confront that fear, pushing in a compassionate way, in a way that recognizes that change is hard, in a way that recognizes that it is so hard to change the worldview that we were raised in. It is so difficult to confront scary change that our understandable response is to react as if the new world is the same as the old. So instead of confronting our challenges, our community took three paths. Those on the left primarily abandoned our community. Some joined the boycott movement because they wanted to use nonviolent protest to change Israel's policies, and because our community did not allow any public discussion of that. Even, by the way, as many of its leaderships refused to purchase products made in the West Bank. And as I said, the board of the Sochnut itself in the summer of 2017 deployed a protest movement by boycotting the dinner with the Prime Minister of Israel. This left-leaning group became more radicalized and alienated. Now, those on the right stayed identified as Jews in the community, but like the left, became increasingly shrill and intolerant of any moderation. As I said, that happened also on the left. For them, we remain firmly in 1958, Israel, right or wrong, with no recognition that the very achievements that should give us pride, that should have given us pride in 2018, its strong military, its being a nuclear power, its robust economy, its technological innovations, its strength in the ag and the tech, in the academic fields, all of those strengths were the very reasons that our worldview about Israel needed to change. And what did the rest of us do? Well, the center majority of our community disengaged. We got out of the business of Israel entirely. We took the path of the great separation, or as Rabbi Jonathan Sachs put it in 2025, we headed towards Babylon. We decided that the North American Jewish people could exist as an entity, leaving Israel engagement to individuals as they wanted. Now, I am sorry that as we build our significant community education platform, we did not emphasize Israel as a focal point because we were so fearful of the controversy. There were good reasons at the time, not just fear-based, but based on what was actually happening. Who could forget, many of you were there, that famous walkout the night I taught my first communal education course on Israel, Wednesday, October 10th, 2018. Wednesday, October 10th, 2018, from 7 to 8:30 at the Federation Building. Open to all. No experience or lots of experience. Who could forget that famous night when we attempted to study the history of Israel and Zionism, not based on party, not based on ideology, not based on biased views, but on basis of history and academic principles of standards of inquiry. We then were forced to build out a platform of Jewish education with less of an emphasis on Israel. We had literally forgotten Jerusalem in order not to offend, as if we really thought we could maintain the integrity and values of Jewish life without the dynamic of the Jewish people and Israel at its core. Excuse me. We have never been just a religion. We have never been just a land. We have never been just a book of the people of the book. We have been and must remain all of those things.